And a good Monday morning to you. Welcome into the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We start off the show this morning with breaking news out of the North Carolina Supreme Court as it relates to the high-stakes race between Republican Jefferson Griffin and Democrat Allison Riggs. To bring us up to date on news that we learned Friday afternoon, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, you have been walking us through this Supreme Court race over the last couple of months. What are the latest details from the Supreme Court Friday afternoon?
Well, big news in that the state Supreme Court actually reached a decision about what to do in this election. Going into Friday afternoon, it was unclear whether the Supreme Court was actually going to make any kind of decision. There was a hint that it might, because it had ordered Jefferson Griffin, the Republican in this case, to submit any paperwork by 11 o'clock Friday morning. So that suggested maybe a decision by Friday afternoon. But if we were expecting a decision, largely it was a decision about whether the Supreme Court was going to take the case or let an earlier ruling by the appeals court stand. Well, actually, the Supreme Court decided to make a decision by a 4-2 vote. The court decided to make three different rulings based on the three different categories of voters that Jefferson Griffin was challenging. The largest group is 60,000 plus people whose voter registration records appeared to lack either a driver's license number or the last four digits of the Social Security number. The state Supreme Court basically said all of those votes are going to count. We're not going to do anything to get rid of those votes. This was a problem caused by the State Board of Elections, but we're not going to take it out on the voters for complying with everything that they were said to do in that case. So the largest part of the votes challenged by Jefferson Griffin are going to count in the election. But the two other categories, very different results. One of them, the smallest category, about 267 voters who are called never residents. These are people who live overseas and have a tie to North Carolina, but have never lived in the state. Those votes were counted in the election. The State Court of Appeals said not to count them, and the state Supreme Court agreed, saying we're not taking up this issue. We're going to stick with what the State Court of Appeals said. So that's 267 votes that get thrown out. Now, we don't know if those are how they're tilted, whether it's toward Riggs or toward Griffin. We assume that they're tilted toward Riggs because they were part of Griffin's protest, but it's not clear how many of those will end up shortening or having that gap get smaller of the 734 votes now between Allison Riggs and Jefferson Griffin, which is right now her margin of potentially victory. So the third category is 5,500 voters overseas, including some military voters who cast ballots in the election without providing photo ID. Now that is, according to the latest court ruling, in violation of the state's voter ID law. The State Court of Appeals would have given these voters 15 days to verify that they have photo ID. If so, their votes would count. If not, their votes would not count. The state Supreme Court goes along with that general idea, but stretches out the period. Instead of being 15 days, there will be 30 calendar days for voters who are overseas who did not provide photo ID to provide the photo ID information. And then after that period is over, those who don't comply, their votes would not count. Those who do comply, their votes would count. And then there will be some sort of recalculation to see what ends up being the impact on the vote totals for Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs, with the potential that there could be enough vote changes that the race would flip from Riggs to Griffin. Now, one other caveat to throw in there, we have talked about the fact that both the State Board of Elections and Allison Riggs have said they might try to take the case back to federal court. Now that there is a ruling that is partially in their favor, but still a ruling that is favoring to some extent Jefferson Griffin, they might try to bring the case now back to federal court and see if the federal court will block all of the things that the state Supreme Court says should happen now.
A lot of information you're walking us through this morning, Mitch. So I heard this 30-day calendar deadline for these overseas voters that did not provide photo identification when they voted, either during early voting or sometime before the November election. When does that start? When does the clock begin to tick on that?
That would really begin once this case gets back to a trial court that would send it back to the State Board of Elections. So remember, what I just said was that there's a potential that this goes back to federal court, and we might have to deal with days or even some weeks of the federal court deciding what to do. Regardless of that, if the federal court allows this process to stand, then the case would have to get from the Supreme Court back to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals presumably would send it back to the trial court. Originally, the trial court would send it to the Board of Elections. Then once the Board of Election gets it, that clock would start. So really, we are still some days away from this clock starting, because the case has to get back into the hands of a trial court to send it back to the Board of Elections. And that will only happen after all of the other courtroom drama plays out, whether it's the federal courts deciding to do or not do anything, or it's just a case of the case going from the state Supreme Court back to the Court of Appeals, then back to a trial court before it goes to the State Board of Elections.
From a political angle on this, Mitch, as you mentioned, this is a semi-favorable ruling for Democrat Allison Riggs. Does she put anything on the line? Does she risk anything by appealing this to a federal court and maybe having a decision coming down that it ends up being worse in her favor? I mean, looking at it from her camp this morning, seems like this is as good of an outcome as maybe they could have gotten from a heavily Republican-controlled Supreme Court here in North Carolina.
I'm not sure that there's a sense that she would get a worse resolution from the federal courts, because the resolution that's in her favor is the Supreme Court saying the large chunk of the votes, the 60,000 plus votes, would count. And so you would have to have a federal court say, no, the state Supreme Court got that wrong. And I don't think that there's an expectation that a federal court would say the state Supreme Court got that piece wrong. If the state Supreme Court had said, don't count those votes, I think there's a greater likelihood that the State Board of Elections and Allison Riggs would have called on the federal courts to reverse that part of the decision. So basically, if they do take this back to federal court, what they would be arguing for is for the overseas voters with photo ID, who did not provide photo ID, to have their votes count, not have to go through this cure process. And potentially, they might also say that the never residents would also have to count, although that's probably a weaker argument at the federal level, since this is entirely based on the state constitution saying that you have to be a resident of North Carolina to be able to vote. So I don't think Riggs or the State Board of Elections would consider that they would lose anything by going to federal court. Their only position now is probably to gain. But to your point, they might decide that this outcome is good enough. Let's go ahead and let it go back, or let's let it go back to the Court of Appeals, see what happens. And if the election ends up flipping from Griffin to Riggs, then try to go back to federal court and challenge the entire process.
How about from the Griffin camp here? We've seen a lot from his legal team over the last couple of weeks, as recently as Friday morning, with them filing paperwork with the state Supreme Court. Do they have any recourse to appeal this to any other higher body if they choose to do so? No.
The Griffin camp is leaving all of their arguments with the state court system. They've not tried to get the case into federal court and have fought federal courts taking up this case at all. So I don't think there's really any avenue at this point for Jefferson Griffin to try to reach beyond the state Supreme Court. Basically, at this point, he has to hope that the process that the Court of Appeals spelled out, as now modified by the state Supreme Court, would lead to enough of a flip in the votes that he would be victorious. But also, I think there's a possibility that if that happened, you would see some sort of attempt once again to take this case back to federal court and say that the state courts got it wrong.
Mitch, as you've walked us through everything again this morning, just tell us what is the vote total that we're looking at? It's about 734 votes. That's how it currently stands right now in favor of Democrat Allison Riggs.
That's right. She leads Jefferson Griffin by 734 votes. The votes that are challenged, that are still in play at this point, 5,500 of those votes were votes that were cast by overseas, including military voters with no photo ID. We don't know the breakdown between Riggs and Griffin, but presumably more of those were for Riggs than for Griffin, or he wouldn't have put them in his election protest. And then there were 267 votes from the never residents, the people who have never lived in North Carolina, but through their parents have had some sort of tie-in to the Tar Heel state that allowed them to vote here. All of those votes don't count. Once again, we don't know how many of them were for Riggs or how many of them were for Griffin. Presumably more of them for Riggs because they were part of Griffin's election protest. But we would not really know how the vote totals change until you have that 30-day cure process and you find out how many of the people with the no photo ID who are overseas can provide photo ID and would still count that, and then taking the totals that have to be removed and seeing how many of them are Riggs voters, how many Griffin voters. That's just something that remains to be seen.
Yeah, it's still a long way to go on all of this. We'll continue to track the details over the coming weeks and potentially months over on our website, carolinajournal.com. Great analysis this morning. We appreciate it. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:16, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at your early Monday morning commute. A look at the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good Monday.
Coming up on Wednesday, April the 16th, that's this Wednesday, I invite you to join us for WBT's News and Brews at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts from 7 to 9 p.m. This will be the first News and Brews of the year, as well as the first one since the election. Of course, there is a lot to talk about, from tariffs to immigration. Got this big decision going on in the North Carolina Supreme Court and more. You can't miss it. We'll all be there for a great time with you. It's WBT's News and Brews coming up this Wednesday, April the 16th at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts. Visit WBT.com for tickets and event details. Keeping our attention this morning on this race for the North Carolina Supreme Court, we do have some new movement on this case over the weekend, where a federal judge has ordered the North Carolina State Board of Elections to proceed with the plan from the state Supreme Court in what they set out Friday afternoon in their ruling for resolving this election dispute in the seat between Democrat Allison Riggs and Republican Jefferson Griffin. U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers issued 2 emergency orders in the case on Saturday. Myers responded to Justice Allison Riggs' emergency motion that she put out Friday evening, seeking an injunction against her colleagues' plans. The state Supreme Court agreed unanimously on Friday to reject Griffin's challenge of more than 60,000 ballots cast by people who appeared to have incomplete voter registration records. However, the court did split 4-2 on 2 other sets of ballot challenges. Justices upheld the state appeals court decision to throw out votes from voters who never lived in the state of North Carolina. The Supreme Court also endorsed the appeals court plan to give overseas voters some time to provide evidence of photo identification to have their ballots counted. The appeals court order originally gave overseas voters 15 business days to complete the task. However, in the state Supreme Court's ruling on Friday, they brought forth a full 30 calendar day window. In Myers' order, he wrote, quote, "Defendant, which is the North Carolina State Board of Elections, is ordered to proceed in accordance with the North Carolina Court of Appeals opinion as modified by the North Carolina Supreme Court in its April the 11th order, but shall not," that's a key legal word, "but shall not certify the results of the election pending further orders of the court." So Myers has said that, yes, go forward in counting, or rather requesting additional information from these overseas voters, but do not certify the election results. Judge Richard Myers also set new deadlines in the case to, quote, "facilitate prompt resolution of the matter. Each party can file an opening brief." They will have to have that in by April the 21st. That is coming up 1 week from today, next Monday, with final briefings due April the 28th. That's 2 weeks from today. Myers indicated that, quote, "he intends to rule on the papers as soon as practical rather than holding oral arguments." So there will be no additional oral arguments in the federal court system for this. That was one of Myers' 2 emergency orders. In his second, Myers also set an April the 15th deadline for the state election board. He said, quote, "the board shall provide notice to the court of its scope of remedial efforts, including the number of potentially affected voters and the counties in which these voters cast ballots. They are required to provide that paperwork to the Federal Court of Appeals, or Superior Court rather, by tomorrow, April the 15th. The total number of ballots affected by Griffin's protest remains pretty unclear at this point as the process moves forward. In an early stage of the case, Myers identified more than 5,500 ballots belonging to overseas voters who provided no photo identification. He also spelled out the 267 votes from never residents that will not be counted. However, Riggs's lawyers and dissenting state Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls have raised questions about those numbers. Griffin's original election protest included 1,409 overseas voters who cast ballots in Guilford County. Griffin expanded that number as the legal process continued, but his protest was limited to votes cast in large Democrat-leaning counties. Justice Anita Earls of the North Carolina Supreme Court wrote on Friday, quote, "He does not challenge the more than 25,000 identically situated voters across the state who voted under the same pre-existing rules. We are not required to clear additional hurdles to have their votes counted in the same exact race for the Supreme Court. If Myers' early numbers stand, more than 5,500 overseas voters who did not provide voter identification would have 30 days to provide that additional photo ID to the State Board of Elections and have their ballots counted. Some 267 voters, as we've talked about, who have never lived in North Carolina will automatically have their votes discarded. There's nothing that is going to take place, nothing they can do on that. Riggs filed an emergency motion Friday seeking an injunction from Myers. The injunction would have blocked the state Supreme Court's ruling from taking effect. The 7-page order signed by the majority, Justice Trey Allen, 4 justices, all Republicans, back in the order, said, quote, "This court is aware of the valid competing interests in this case and need for an expeditious resolution of the election that occurred more than 5 months ago and the importance of ensuring that only lawful votes are counted. Rather than accepting a petition to take up the case with a new set of written briefs and oral arguments, Friday's order responded to an April the 4th opinion from the State Court of Appeals. That court split 2-1 in spelling out a process for addressing each of the 3 categories in which Griffin had challenged those votes. So that is the latest that we are tracking this morning. We are expecting, at least in the next day or so, well, not in the next day or so, in the next day, by tomorrow, the State Board of Elections does have to provide information to Justice Richard Myers, U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers, as to how many ballots are really in question. Again, I'll remind you, only 734 votes separate Republican Jefferson Griffin and Democrat Allison Riggs. As of right now, it seems like there will be somewhere in the ballpark of 5,500 ballots that could be under scrutiny. We will wait to get those additional details and those final numbers from the Court of Appeals and the State Board of Elections, and then that 30-day calendar window period will start. And we don't exactly know the process yet. The State Board has not laid that out. So a lot of moving parts still. We'll keep a very close eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And, of course, you can read additional details as soon as we get them over on our website, carolinajournal.com. Where it's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at the roadways this morning. A look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you.
It's 5:35. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has denied North Carolina's request for a 180-day extension on 100% coverage for costs matched for eligible recovery expenses as it relates to Hurricane Helene, according to Governor Josh Stein in an announcement on Friday. Now, we've got to go back a couple of months, but back on September the 29th of last year, 2 days after Helene ripped through western North Carolina, then President Joe Biden approved a federal disaster declaration for the state, which made federal funding available for public assistance, hazard mitigation, and other needs for other various assistant needs with a federal cost sharing of 75%. The storm caused more than $60 billion in estimated damages. A few days after that, on October the 2nd, then President Biden also approved an amendment that increased the federal cost sharing for debris removal and emergency response to 100% for the first 180 days of the incident period, retroactively starting on September the 25th of 2024. When the incident period ended in March, the federal match dropped to 90% for eligible expenses, with state and local governments being responsible for the remaining 10%. In December of last year, Biden had increased the federal cost share for public assistance projects from 75 to 90% after the 180-day period. Governor Josh Stein responded in a statement to FEMA's announcement saying, quote, "The need in western North Carolina remains immense. People need debris removed, homes rebuilt, and roads restored. I am extremely disappointed and urge the president to reconsider FEMA's bad decision even for 90 days. 6 months later, the people of western North Carolina are working hard to get back on their feet. They need FEMA to help them get the job done." In February, Stein requested an extension of the 100% federal cost share for debris removal and emergency protective measures, including direct federal assistance, for an additional 180 days. According to the denial letter, which was obtained by the Asheville Citizen-Times newspaper, FEMA's acting administrator said that the extension request was, quote, "not warranted based on the agency's review," while giving the state 30 days to appeal the decision. The letter reads, in part, that the current disaster and current recovery efforts that are taking place in western North Carolina are continuing, and the extension is, quote, "not warranted based on reviews from FEMA." In response to that, Representative Chuck Edwards wrote, quote, "Due to the extensive scope and scale of continuing recovery work, we are concerned that a reduction in federal cost share at this time will risk undercutting what is currently underway, particularly the significant debris removal efforts that are being led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and its contractors." In response to the denial, Edwards, in an April the 11th email to the Asheville Citizen-Times, described a 100% cost share extension for 180 days as unprecedented. He said, quote, "Instead, I'm focusing on other ways that we can make tangible differences in helping the citizens of western North Carolina recover more quickly. This includes continuing to assist survivors with FEMA casework and working with the administration to find additional avenues to alleviate the financial stress on our communities and the state of North Carolina." So this happening late in the day on Friday, likely to get some more reaction potentially today. If not, over the next couple of days, we'll keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:39, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. There is a hearing scheduled later on today in Raleigh as it relates to appointment authority over the North Carolina State Board of Elections. There's been some law changes over the last couple of months that we've been tracking here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. To get some details on that this morning, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, state law as it stands right now, as we're here about halfway through the month of April, on May the 1st, State Auditor Dave Bullock's office would take some oversight authority over the State Board of Elections. What's going on in Raleigh later today?
Well, there's a hearing on a proposal from Governor Josh Stein to block the election board changes that would shift authority over appointments to the election board and oversight of the elections board to the state auditor's office. People who've been following this very closely know that there's been a long-standing effort of the North Carolina General Assembly to change oversight of the Board of Elections. And in each instance, when they've made a potential change, the courts have struck it down, including a proposal to split the state elections board evenly between Republicans and Democrats. Right now, there's a 3-2 majority for the governor's party. And since the governor's a Democrat, it's a 3-2 Democratic majority. But when the General Assembly passed a bill to have a board that would have 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, the case went before a 3-judge Superior Court panel. The panel struck down that idea. And as the case was continuing, because they had issued an injunction without actually having a final ruling, as that case was continuing to go through the courts, then the General Assembly changed the law again. In late 2024, in Senate Bill 382, one of the provisions in that wide-ranging bill shifted Elections Board appointments and Elections Board oversight to the state auditor, Dave Bullock. Right after that happened, outgoing Governor Roy Cooper and incoming Governor Josh Stein sued over that provision. Now Stein is alone in pursuing that suit since Cooper is out of office. But Stein has asked for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction against that change. He'd like to see that injunction and temporary restraining order before May 1st, so Dave Bullock would never have the chance to make those appointments. And so that's what the hearing in the Wake County Superior Court is dealing with. It's the same 3-judge panel that struck down the last attempt to rework the elections board, so it'll be interesting to see if they like this idea any better than the others. One of the differences, and one of the arguments that the General Assembly has been making in its court filings, including a court filing that came down on Thursday, is that this is a different situation because the authority to appoint the elections board is not being taken away from the executive, because in the last plan it was going to be moving from the governor to legislators themselves. In this case, you're moving the appointment authority to another elected executive branch official. And basically, the General Assembly has argued, look, we have the authority to give duties to the other members of the Council of State, the other statewide executive branch elected officials. And so we're just doing what we could do under our constitutional authority, giving some duties to the state auditor. The governor doesn't have all the executive authority. North Carolina has never been in that situation. And so Governor Josh Stein doesn't have any constitutional legs to stand on in making this case. Obviously, on the other side, the governor is saying, no, this is the type of authority that the governor has to have, and it's going to be up to this 3-judge panel to make a decision. The panel did decide when setting the hearing that it would definitely make a decision by May 1st. So there should be some sort of resolution that will either say, yes, Dave Bullock can make these new appointments, or no, he can't, and then the court case would continue from there.
And obviously, we'll see that presumably in the next 2 weeks or so as we get closer to that May the 1st deadline. Now, Mitch, for folks that follow national elections here across the United States, they've probably seen in a lot of states, Arizona is one of the big ones, the Secretary of State is the individual that typically, in many states, has the authority over the election board. So I guess, obviously, we're not talking about the Secretary of State here in North Carolina, but taking it out of the governor ship and directly under the governor's control is not something that you would say is uncommon throughout the rest of the U.S.
No, that's certainly true. And in North Carolina, it's really supposed to be an independent agency, but where the governor has authority is that the governor gets to make appointments to the board. It's a 5-member board. The governor could appoint 3 members from his own political party and 2 members from the other major party. And that's what they've done so that that board would be slanted toward the governor's party, whichever party it is that's in power at the time. It could have been a situation where the General Assembly could have said, other states use the Secretary of State. We're going to move the Board of Elections under the Secretary of State. But once again, you have a Republican-led General Assembly. Our Secretary of State for many years now has been a Democrat. And so that's one of the reasons why I think they ended up choosing another official. It's also one of the points that Governor Stein has been making is that, wait a minute, no other state has the auditor in charge of the elections, and that the Republican General Assembly only did this because the auditor is a Republican and they think they'll get support for Republican board members on the Board of Elections and shift the board in a way that should not be done. It'll be very interesting to see whether this 3-judge panel, which did not like the past idea of having a split 4-4 Democrat-Republican Board of Elections, whether it likes this idea any better.
We'll be watching this legal process play out throughout the day today. You can read the details as they become available over on our website, carolinajournal.com. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:46, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
554. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. A concerning story this morning. An American citizen living in Thailand pleaded guilty last Wednesday to threatening to kill U.S. Senator Tom Tillis and his staff in September of 2021. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of North Carolina, 53-year-old Eric Charles Welton pled guilty to one count of threatening a federal official on account of his duties and faces up to 10 years in prison when he is sentenced in July. It's the latest news surrounding threats against Tillis, his family, and his staff. According to court documents and information presented in court, Welton made multiple harassing and intimidating calls to the office of Republican elected officials and GOP organizations in the United States. He claimed he made the threatening calls because he was angry about the large number of unsolicited political emails that he was receiving. In September of 2021, Welton spoke with a staff member at Tillis's Raleigh office and threatened to show up and kill them. Welton also threatened to come to North Carolina and mow down, quote, the entire staff in the state and find the person who had been sending him the emails. He is also alleged to have made threats against U.S. Marines and others working at a U.S. consulate in Thailand. That was in November of 2022. In one voicemail, Welton allegedly stated he was going to, quote, kill a bunch of Marines, end quote, due to anger over immigration issues that he was dealing with. In May of 2023, FBI Charlotte and FBI Atlanta special agents arrested Welton at the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta as he returned to the United States from overseas. Acting U.S. Attorney Daniel P. Berber said in a Thursday press release, quote, threatening to kill a public official and his staff is not only despicable, but is also an affront to our democratic system of government. Our office will continue to work closely with our law enforcement partners to investigate and prosecute threats or intimidation against public officials so they can properly carry out their important duties. Threats against Tillis, his family, and his staff continued last year when he received multiple threatening voicemails that he went then ahead and released on social media. Very explicit voicemails and emails that Senator Tillis published. We have talked about those in the past. Of course, can't play or really read any of those comments here on the air for you this morning. Looking at some other comments, the special agent in charge of the FBI in North Carolina, Robert DeWitt, said, quote, it is unacceptable to make violent threats against anyone. But when these threats are directed at an elected official, it can impact their ability to effectively serve their constituents and their country. The FBI will not tolerate this type of intimidation for any reason, especially when it comes to those who help run our democracy. The calls are part of a growing and disturbing trend against political figures in recent months, with some pointing the blame at extreme left-wing groups protesting Donald Trump and elections that, of course, have taken place over the last couple of years. You can read some additional details on this story by visiting our website this morning, carolinajournal.com. Well, expecting another busy Monday across North Carolina, a lot going on, specifically dealing with that Supreme Court race. We will keep a close eye on it. That's going to do it for a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.